And now here to discuss two major issues that are plaguing the EU, both the Green Deal and defence. These are two top priorities in these coming elections. We are now joined by Professor Iain Begg, who is Professor at the European Institute at the London School of Economics. Good afternoon, sir, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Good afternoon to you.
So I'd like to, Dzień dobry. So first I'd like to ask you, some say that Europe doesn't have enough money to cover the expenses of both the Green Deal and defence. These are two top priorities for us at the moment, and European politicians will have to choose. Do you agree with this statement?
I agree if you were talking about the EU level, where the size of the budget is so small, it's basically around 1% of GDP. It certainly isn't going to be able to deal with these two things as European public goods. From a national point of view, there are other choices that can be made. The big budgets in nearly every member state of the EU relate to welfare payments. The expenditure on the Green Deal and the expenditure on the defence-related capabilities is a relatively small component of overall public expenditure. So it'd be about trying to rationalise expenditure on other things rather than choosing between these two.
That's a very good point. Now, okay, so if I understand this correct, we're going to have to make a choice between defense spending, which is basically non-negotiable, I think, in this day and age with the Russian aggression that we're seeing, and the Green Deal. But then again, we also have social payments and welfare payments and health care and things like that are subsidized by the state. So will the quality of life have to then decline if we want to accomplish our green goals? And actually, is that going to be something that's more non-negotiable for citizens? And so therefore, first in line could be perhaps some of the elements in the Green Deal.
Yes, the Green Deal is a long-term project, which means that there's going to be a succession of public investments over many decades, with the target that's been announced for many countries of 2050, so that's 2.5 decades. The total amount being committed to green deals is not that huge. And there's also a big debate about whether expenditure on Green Deal, which means introducing new forms of energy production, using wind, using solar, using other potential energy sources, is itself a source of economic activity and therefore of growth, rather than something which is purely to be seen as a cost. And that means that when you talk about whether the Green Deal needs to be sacrificed to add 1 percentage point of GDP to defence spending, as seems to be the norm, countries talking about moving from 1.5 to 2 to 2.5. It's not that huge in the aggregate public expenditure. However, trade-offs are the meat and drink of all economists. Trade off one thing for another thing, and you will lose some of the benefits of the other thing if you trade off in favour of the Green Deal or trade off in favour of defence.
But the Green Deal is actually the source of a lot of contention here in Europe, and many say that it actually has to be readdressed and reformatted actually for it to work in the long term.
Yes, what's happening in some countries is a slight slowing down of the pace towards net zero, which is a key component of the Green Deal. The Green Deal obviously extends beyond that, but the net zero is a big target. Countries like Germany and the UK have already announced that they're going to slow down progress towards having 100% electric vehicles, installation of heat pumps, which are highly costly, but they impose costs on individuals as well as on the state. So it's important to see it through the double lens of the cost to the consumer as well as the cost to the state. Overall, the cost to the state of the Green Deal is not that huge, which is the point I keep making, and therefore it can be accommodated within other elements. And if the Green Deal succeeds in Ursula von der Leyen's ambition of adding to GDP, then the proportion of GDP that's spent on it could be self-financing.
Right, I understand that. And actually, well, that's a great question. Is the Green Deal going to provide the economic dynamic growth that the European politicians are banking on at this point? Is the Green Deal the only way that the European economy can be innovative, dynamic, and and actually grow and be competitive and keep up with the likes of the United States or rising China?
It's not the only way, but it is a way. The basis of the von der Leyen Commission's approach to all this is to emphasize green and digital. Now, clearly, digital is something in which Europe as a whole, including the United Kingdom, including other countries not in the EU, lags behind the Americans and increasingly the Chinese. So there's a strong case for investing there. But there are other coming sectors, notably biosciences, where Europe has some advantages. Just think of the development of the mRNA vaccines and the subsequent cancer cures, which have been done by companies like BioNTech in Germany. And you see there's the basis for another new form of development. Now, the Green Deal has been the centerpiece of the von der Leyen Commission's approach to mobilizing economic activity. Its results are indifferent so far, but I think the thrust of it is still one that is desirable from a European perspective. And we shouldn't get too hung up on the budgetary cost of it, because that's only a second-order question.
Well, on the back of that, what are the greatest challenges for the European economy, keeping in mind the dissatisfaction of the farmers, which is only escalating now?
Well, in one word, growth. The lack of growth in most European countries means that the denominator of all these ratios we talk about, expenditure as a proportion of GDP, defense expenditure as a proportion of GDP, if GDP itself is not growing, then it becomes that much harder to share the spoils of that economic activity. So getting growth should be the fundamental challenge for European economies. It's been difficult because, as you know, several countries in the EU have been highly dependent over the years on Russian oil and gas. Poland is the exception, but even Poland is dependent on American LNG and other imported sources of energy. So countering that dependence on imports from other parts of the world, which is one ambition of renewables strategy within the Green Deal, is one way over, say, a 5 to 10 year period in which you can hope to boost growth. The trouble is, don't expect it to be an instant success.
Okay, well, Professor Iain Begg, the European Institute, London School of Economics, thank you very much for joining us today on TVP World. We appreciate your input and your insight. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.